Welcome to the Big Woods Bucks podcast. I'm your host, Hal Blood, sitting here with Lee Shands, my co-host. And once again, we're up to Paul Hughes, and we're in his studio recording another podcast. And what are we going to talk about this time, Lee?
Pretty much what the definition of big woods is.
Yeah. We've probably over the years have said it or something, but that's what the topic is. But before we get started on that, we've been getting quite a few, good comments from you and emails for topics, and we appreciate all the comments and keep that going. And then don't forget, we have our sister podcast, the Adirondack podcast, and you can get that on our YouTube channel, or you have to subscribe separately if you get it at iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify or whatever else way you get it just for the audio. So anyway, we'll get into this topic. And when I wrote my first book, I kind of had to define what the big woods was, because I had grown up hunting in southern Maine where it was rural and farm country. And then again, when I started to be able to go down to hunt at my relative's hunting lodge, it was a lot of farm country there, and the actual mountain we hunted on was a reverted farmland. It had grown back up into oak, and there was still a lot of the old homesteads were there with apple trees and all of that. So I couldn't refer to that as big woods. And from hunting there, when I first came up here, when I first came north, I knew I was hunting a totally different deer. I've talked about that many a times. But so my definition in my book I wrote was deer that don't have access to agriculture. And it was the easiest way I could define the big woods, because yes, we have all of northern Maine is pretty much big woods, but northern New Hampshire, there's some in northern Vermont. But there's also big woods in the south. You get those big mountains down in the Appalachian Mountains all the way down through. There's no farm country there. That's all big woods. And, you get out in the Midwest, upper UP of Michigan and northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, Montana. I mean, there's big woods. There's big woods a lot of places, but I think mostly when we're talking about it, we're relating it to where, because we track a lot, to where there's snow. But just so you know, that's the definition. Because the agriculture is controls where the deer feed. Because typically in that kind of areas, that's pretty much the only feed, unless they get some acorns or whatever. So, but anyways, they're controlled by it, and that's why if you watch any of the, Midwest or whatever shows on deer hunting, most everybody's hunting out of a tree stand or something, and, watching agriculture, whether it's natural or, I know in the last 10, 15 years, the big thing's been food plots. So there it is. That's the definition. No agriculture, because agriculture patterns the deer. Heard that phrase before. When I used to have hunters come up, you probably did too, Lee. They would come up, when I had, especially the ones, not the guided hunts, but the ones that were hunting on their own, they said, well, I want to come up a few days early and see if I can pattern a deer. And I go, you don't have to worry about that. You're not going to pattern a deer up here. And was a foreign concept to most people, quite frankly, most everybody, until they came up and tried it, right? I mean, once they saw what they were up against, they knew they couldn't pattern them. So
one of the words that you used was nomadic.
Yeah.
The deer, they travel greater distances. Instead of traveling to like food plots or farm fields or apple orchards or whatever, they're going to these doe groups. They know before the season there's different little groups of does that are living in these different areas. But in northern Maine where we hunt, and be the same, I'm sure, in New York and other places, there's vast tracts of land where there aren't any deer in it. So these bucks are going from doe group to doe group, and they're more nomadic. And then actually, by definition, after the season's over, a lot of those deer are going to a yard, whether it was a natural deer yard from years before, or now a lot of them, they go to town. But down the southern half of Maine, those deer are living out in people's backyards and living on the same 50 or 100 acres behind some farmer's field their whole life, basically. They might travel a little bit, but they're there. Yeah. They're not traveling 50 or 75 miles to go off to a deer yard somewhere. And they're also, in November when you're hunting them, they're basically where they are.
Yeah, and they're checking does there, but since the does are pretty much staying in one place, the bucks just keep coming back and forth there. Here's a few words from our sponsors. They're all top-notch people. We're glad to have them aboard. Make sure you support them. That's what keeps us going. Being the low-tech guy I am, there's one thing I've learned to embrace with technology, and it's my Onyx. I used to carry maps and GPS when it finally came out and stuff, but the Onyx has eliminated that because I've got my GPS in my phone now with my Onyx app. I can mark everything in that. It's helpful that I can show other people by putting a pin in if I want to send somebody to a place. Being a guide, that's important, I can give them the pin, put it in there as, I text it to them, whatever. So if you want to get your Onyx, get your Big Woods Bucks code, BWB, and get you 20% off, but I highly recommend it. Give you a little update. Skinner Sights. We all know they're the best site going, but it's a great company because Andy and the crew there are innovative, and they're always thinking up either new models to make a site for, improve the sites, making mounts for scopes, and now they've come on with their own line of scopes and red dots. Whatever Andy does in the company, it's top-notch, first quality, and they stand behind everything, and we're glad to have them as a partner, and we hope you'll try their sites, and you can trust your life with those, and they're going to get you the game. So get your Skinner sights, and you can trust me that you're going to be glad you did. Just wanted to talk a little bit about minus 33 in the wool they have, which I believe is best wool going, whether it's base layers or your socks or whatever you're wearing. You got to have wool. I've been stressing that for people for years, to wear your wool, whether it's the outerwear or even your base layers and socks. I've been to the tour of the plant, see how they make their socks, and it's quality, the fit is right, and they're going to be long lasting. I've got socks I've had now for several years, and they look like I'll have them for several years more before they even think about wearing out. So I trust my life to wool, and you can too. Minus 33. All right, back to the podcast. The other thing I forgot to mention was the Adirondacks is another area of the whole Adirondack Park, pretty much. That's all, big woods too. And, so I got a good example of which is pretty funny. Man, we just talked about him the other day. A friend of mine has passed away now. He got in a tragic accident with his truck, but he moved up to Jackman from Massachusetts. Oh, I don't know. I think about it now, it's at least 15 years ago. He's been gone probably 5, 6, maybe more than that. I lose track of time, but anyways, he bought a piece of land. I think he bought like 100 acres and settled in, and he had a lot of wood on it, spruce and fir, and he wanted to have it logged, thinned out. So he had hired a logging contractor to come in and he had it logged, and while he was there, he asked him if he could, with his excavator, if he could grub out some food plots. So he had him clear cut, like, I think 3 1-acre plots, what he was going to be his food plots. And then he stumped him out and everything. And his name was Troy. And Troy went and he had one of those Kubota tractors or something. And he got the lime and he tested the soil and fertilized it. And he went and planted, I don't know if he planted them each one differently, but he'd plant, that brassicas and alfalfa and broccoli and all that stuff. And he did that for, I know, at least 3 years and maybe 4. And he's in the middle of, he was just, right along 201 there, but there's no, in town where there is one farm in town, and it's not an agricultural farm, but he was like 5 or 6 miles from town. And in all those years, he never had one deer step foot in a food plot. He had moose. The moose would come and eat the brassicas and whatever, but probably broccoli or whatever, but that's it. Never had a deer in all those years. And I told him when he did it, I said, Troy, I don't think you'll have any deer come down in here, because people don't realize, and it's because most areas that have farm country, or maybe in the Midwest where they have, a lot of farmland and a lot of deer, there's no browse or anything for them to eat. So they're just eating farm food, whatever they can get there. Whatever's planted is their main food source. I'm sure there's a little bit of this and that. Again, if there's a year where there's oaks and they can get some acorns. But in the big woods, any big woods, whether it's up north here or Adirondacks or whatever, they have to get their food wherever they are, so they don't go to one place to get it, because it's pretty much the same anywhere. Now there's some places where there's not a lot of feed, but the difference between here and the Adirondacks would be there is places they still log there where they've got easements with the landowners that they sold it, usually paper companies and stuff, where they can still cut for a certain amount of years and before the state takes over the land. But for us up north where they log, well, wherever they log is a food plot, right? Every skid rut, everywhere they cut, there's brand new growth for the next few years there. And it's like a big garden for them. Well, you might say, well, they're going to come and go to that. Well, no, because those are usually pretty big, but they may spend their time there, like especially a buck in the summer. He might live once a cut grows up and leaves come out and it's good cover, but they leave that when the leaves come off. But even in the open woods, the woods that hasn't been cut, there's so many green plants, things that fall down as old man's beard. I mean, there's just so much food that they don't come and go. And that's where the nomadic you're talking about comes in. So they have their territories. And I've learned over the years that I think as the bucks get older, they expand their territory a little bit. And some of them, depending on how many does in the area, that probably controls how far they need to travel to find enough does to keep them occupied in the rut. But so that's basically it, how I would describe it,
I can give you a really good example. You've been on that road, I'm sure, but up in Zone 2 where we hunt moose, I can remember years ago, it's a gravel road now, and they've logged in probably another 5 to 10 miles in beyond that, but there was a little side road off the Blanchette Road, and it's where the pig man, when he shot that big moose with his bow with me, he got it in on this road, and then a year or two later, my dad got his big bull in there. When you would go in on that side road, the road split, and the left-hand road was the gravel road. That's where they logged, and that's where they had a road that they ditched and hauled gravel. But if you went straight in on that road, not very far, it was a winter road. They just basically ditched it. They never hauled any gravel or shale or anything. And it went down a hill down towards a little stream. So when they pulled out of there, it just ended at that stream. When they pulled out of there, they seeded that winter road with clover. And evidently the dirt there must have had some nutrients in it, because that thing was just lush, thick, green clover. I mean, nice looking clover. And the first time that I was in there, when I walked in there, I thought, I wonder if moose like clover, because I'd never hunted them in a clover patch. But I said, if nothing else, I bet there'll be a bunch of deer in here. Well, we hunted that place for a couple of years, because right down where that little stream was, there was a little bog down below it that always had a bunch of moose tracks in the mud. And there was winter rubs in there, fir trees that were rubbed up. So we hunted that a few different times and tried to call moose out. It was most of that area was pretty thick at the time, but you could see 200 yards down that clover road, and there was enough moose sign there. I thought, maybe we'll call a moose out into this. But I come to, after a while, you'd walk through that thick green clover. There was almost nothing for tracks, and there was almost no moose poop or deer poop in it. And I come to that those deer and moose, they just weren't used to eating clover. So I'm not saying they wouldn't come to it, but basically they just ignored it. And we hunted there for quite a few years and never saw a deer or a moose out in it. Just wasn't their thing.
Yeah. I've never seen where moose eat clover, but there probably weren't a lot of deer there either in that area.
But there were enough deer in that area. I would have thought that they would have gone towards that. Like I said, that road was pretty long, and it was wide enough to, get a big truck down. And it was probably, if I had to guess, I bet there was 2 or 3 acres of clover there.
Yeah.
And you would have thought that would have called all the critters to that area, but it didn't.
Yeah, but also in the cuts, like I said, in all the little skid roads where they turn the dirt up, there's 10 kinds of green plants that grow, right?
Right.
Yeah. So it's different. People always wondered what they eat there, so we'll get into that. What do the deer eat in the big woods? We're going to have a film come out on that too, but to show you what it is instead of just saying it. But I don't even know what all the green plants are they eat. There's some, that you'll notice some that you see them quite often, but I think about any green plant they'll eat, The one thing that's green, especially, and it stays green, as I've talked about before, is those, I used to call them fiddlehead buds, but they're really it's called a wood fern.
Right.
And those are in the woods. I don't know about down south, but we have them all across the north here. They're in the Adirondacks. It's one of I think the major feeds in the Adirondacks, because they don't have a lot of browse, but they eat them wood ferns and the buds and stuff for the next year's buds in them. So it's just a fern, but most ferns turn brown when the frost comes and they die, but these wood ferns, they stay green, and they'll eat the fern, but I think they like the bud better because they'll start pouring in there and they'll get the new buds. They're about the size of a pea, and they'll root them out with their bottom teeth there and eat those. They'll eat green raspberry leaves, huh?
I was going to touch on that. The biggest buck, I'll post a picture of that sometime, but the biggest buck that I ever killed weighed 245 pounds, and I've got a picture of him in the back of my truck, and it looks like his belly is swelled right up. He's so fat. I actually was able to, it was down a skid trail, but it was so cold and froze up, I drove my truck down, was able to load that deer in my truck, and I was probably at least a half a mile off the nearest road, but that skid trail was good. I had some big rubber on my truck, and it was a short box Ford. I drove right down, loaded that deer. When I gutted that deer out, I waited until I got down to a little spring so I could wash him out, wash my hands and everything. He was completely full of green raspberry. I don't know how long it took him to eat that many green raspberry leaves, but he was completely full, his paunch of green raspberry leaves.
Yep.
Yep.
I'm sure they eat them when they first come out, but I've noticed when they're eating raspberries, you know how raspberries, they keep growing in the same place and the stalks get thicker and thicker?
Yeah.
They don't seem to bother with that. It's always like the newest raspberries, the thinner ones, and they'll eat probably like in the summer when they're first growing, they eat not just the leaf, but they probably nip back a ways where they get several leaves at once and stuff. And those actually, there'll still be on some of them, there'll be green leaves in early November.
Yeah.
You know, and then they'll finally, once we get snow, the snow knocks them down and then they fall off.
And the hard frost will, they start turning brown and dying out. But
Yeah.
that buck, I can't remember what week. I don't remember what week I shot him, to tell you the truth. But I just remember we didn't have snow yet, and the raspberry leaves were still really green and lush.
Yeah, it was probably early then, because usually they go from green to yellow and then brown. And yeah. I notice when they get yellow, they don't even bother with them. But them green ones, they'll get into them. And then, of course, they'll always, it's kind of funny that some of the things they eat, because some of the things they eat more for food and some things they eat for the mineral in it or the vitamin, whatever you want to call it. There's something in that certain plants that their body needs and they know it. And so some of that they eat for that. Like I watched a doe and her little one feeding on a little short fir, eating the needles off in it, just like plucking and eating fir needles in October. You think they'd have to be starving to eat them. I mean, they'll eat them in the winter, but must be some kind of a vitamin, a mineral in that they was getting out of that. And then, of course, we know they browse any little saplings. But even the deer and the moose seem to like those red maples the best. We call them swamp maples or whatever. When those are new, I think they're a lot softer and stuff than the white maples, the sugar maples. But
I don't know if you do this, but over the years I've tried about everything. If the deer eat it, I try it to see what it tastes like. The one thing that I don't understand, it must be the nutrients in it, but I tried eating some of that old man's beard and it tastes like dirt. It's awful tasting stuff. But it's got something in it.
It's got medicinal stuff, because I've seen on those, there's a book there that's like old time stuff, and they claim that moss is like a natural antibiotic or whatever, and it's good for you. So if I was going to eat it, I'd have to doctor it up a little bit, put some
I guess of all the stuff,
put some blue cheese dressing on it, and probably slide down all right.
Of all the stuff that they eat, and I don't know enough about the mushrooms to know. I mean, I know some, we used to call them beefsteak mushrooms, those ones that grow in clumps on the side of standing dead hardwoods. But, mushrooms taste pretty good, and they know which ones to eat and which ones not to eat. But you'll see, that was one of the things I first learned when I came up into the big woods, because I grew up in farm country in Farmington. But when I was 13 and went north up in Cocajo there and shot my first deer, probably shortly thereafter, I noticed that the deer will paw the leaf. If there's something for little mushrooms that grow at ground level, they'll paw the leaves out around them or grass or whatever and nip those. They like mushrooms.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of different kinds of mushrooms they eat. And usually, unless they're on a tree, if they're on the ground, you usually don't notice that they ate them, but they did. But any of those, to me, they eat the ones that are soft. Some on them logs, you get them like kind of bright orange ones that are leafy and soft. They eat those, and I'm sure any of the soft ones. And then on the hardwood trees, it's either on the birch or yellow birch, maple, white birch. They have mushrooms. Most of those they're hard. They're more of a fungus or something, but I call them like oyster shells because they're so hard a deer couldn't eat them anyways. But there's a mushroom that grows only on the white birch. I've never seen it on anything else. And I call them marshmallow mushrooms because that's what they look like to me. And
I know what you're talking about.
different sizes. They start out little and they grow, but they're usually always they're growing on a white birch that's dying or dead, and it must be something to do with the moisture in it that it can take out of it. And but those are real. They're almost spongy soft, and I call them marshmallows because they're white. They have a tinge of tan on them, and like the underneath part is kind of tannish. But if you take one of those and pull it off the tree, like before it freezes, you can bust them in half. This almost rubbery feeling, but when you break them in half, it almost looks like meat. You know what I mean? And they love those. Those I've tracked bucks before, and when they get ready to lay down, if they've come to one of those, they'll eat a bunch of those off a birch tree and then just go lay down. Because, you think about that. If you get a bunch of them, they weigh a half a pound apiece. It's a pretty captive place to eat there, and they just can get a belly full quick. But they all eat them, the bucks, the does. And then a lot of times they can't get them until that birch dies, and they usually stand a long time, and they'll have a bunch of them up high, and then when it falls down, they'll get them, So that's another good food for them. Hi, Hal here, host of the Big Woods Bucks podcast. We're excited to announce our partnership with the most respected and recognized land company in the Northeast, Christmas and Associates Land Company. Owners Dan and Mark Christmas are two upstate New York natives with deep roots in the Adirondacks and Tug Hill Plateau, as well as two of the most passionate big woods hunters you'll meet. Whether it's newly constructed camp surrounded by state wilderness or family getaway, their team of experienced land guides are the best at matching folks with a perfect land track at an affordable price. They even provide financing. Christmas Land Guides will provide full land tours using ATVs, snowmobiles, and even snowshoes so that you can scout every acre. Christmas Land and Camp staff also help you construct the camp you've always dreamed of using our in-the-house master builders. For over 35 years, no one in New York State has provided more big buck properties and family hunting camps to hundreds of folks who love the woods than Christmas and Associates Land Company. Dan and Mark and the whole company remain dedicated to wise land conservation and treating everyone they meet like family. Always available 7 days per week unless there's fresh tracking snow. Call 800-229-7843 or visit Land and Camps on Facebook or go to landandcamps.com. Of course, cedar, we all know they eat cedar. Most of the cedar they get is if a big cedar blows down or something, big fluffy one, or maybe the limb blows off or the top blows off. And
one thing I want to touch on, I've noticed, I don't know what their reasoning capabilities are, but a lot of times during deer season, if you see a big cedar that's blown down, it's almost like they're saving it. They know it's there, but they won't strip that until, like, I've seen them during muzzleloader season. If you get a lot of snow and stuff, they'll go and you can see them. They'll walk right around them cedar trees, 2 or 3 deer, until they've stripped it. But earlier in the season, I've seen them walk right by those down cedar trees. It's almost like they're saving them for later.
Yeah, I don't know what's up with that, really. I've seen that too, but then I've seen some down early in the season that are stripped. I think it might depend on if they're hanging around there. But,
how hungry they are too.
Yeah, but definitely if one of them, you get a snow and a wind and a top or one blows down, when there's snow on the ground, they're eating it.
They're eating it.
Yeah, and they say the biologists say it's the only feed, like here in Maine or in the big woods, white cedar is the only thing they can eat in the winter, that if they get enough of white cedar, they can maintain their body weight through the winter.
That's why it's a crying shame. I hate it when you go to northern Maine and you see those great big cedar trees and they cut them and there'll be a pile of them, but then they don't do anything because they're hollow in the middle. I'm like, it's kind of too bad to cut those things. They ain't good for anything anyway.
Yeah, unless they're logging in where there's, and where there's some deer staying, it helps them out there. But yeah, they like that cedar. I was last fall there. I had Ryland, and was it snowy that day? Yeah, it snowed a little bit. We had a little snow, and it was one of them days that it just started in. It was up in the high country, but a big limb fell off a cedar. It was a pretty good sized cedar, and must have got weighted with snow or something happened, but this limb fell off. And the funny part was we'd just seen a doe and a little fella run off. We were sneaking up through it. We just got done looking at a signpost, and then we saw the doe and the lamb. And then we were just poking up through that wet run, and I looked over and I could see that cedar limb there. And they had already, it was probably that doe and a lamb that run off. That must have fell down in the night, and it wasn't cleaned up, but they'd eaten a lot of it just in that one night. But I've seen from following bucks before, because we know cedar's got a lot of odor to it. They make them cedar pillows and stuff. And I don't have a good nose, but I can smell it. But I think they can smell that from a half a mile. I've been tracking a buck before, and all of a sudden they kind of veer off course and walk a little ways, and all of a sudden there's a blown down cedar or something. Well, they can smell that stuff a long ways. And
because you don't have as much hemlock. The further north you go, like over in the corridor where we are in the Western Mountains, most of the hemlock's a little bit further south. But somebody told me that they eat the hemlock like in the wintertime.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the moose will eat fur, and it fills their belly, but there really isn't a lot of nutrition in it. It's the same thing. The deer, they love the cedar, and the cedar will actually help them. The hemlock really doesn't do much for them, but they will eat it. There's something in it enough so that they eat it, but it really won't maintain their body weight.
Yep. Yeah. And then there's the stuff they like to browse stuff. And another thing you'll see if we know that the new stuff that grows is succulent and it's nice, but the big trees, the buds on the bigger trees at the top is the most nutritious of the feed. So if a big maple, yellow birch, whatever blows down, even a white birch, it's got those little I call them partridge feet buds on them. The deer will go to them and clean that up too. Them big, especially them red maples, if you get one of them that blows down, the buds even in November are pretty beefy and meaty. They'll go around and nip all them buds off. And some of those, if it grows in around some softwood, those will have moss on it, some of those hardwood trees. And you'll see where the deer will pick. It won't be like big strings of fuzzy moss, usually like on the firs, but there'll be some and they'll nip at that. And then the yellow birch, the yellow birch get the big seed there. It's like a seed pod. And then it falls apart. That's why you'll see them all over the snow in the winter if they fall out. But the deer will go and eat those. Must be because it's every one of them little seeds or something, and they'll eat that stuff. And then, and it's kind of funny. I've noticed sometimes the bucks will eat different things than the does too, and I don't know if it's higher nutrition or I don't know what it is, but maybe it's just because some things they can eat a lot of it in one-stop shopping. It's like going up to the drive-thru at Burger King, and they can eat pretty quickly instead of going down to the salad bar and pick around. But the old man's beard is another one. If you get one of those, like a big old fir or spruce that blows down, I've tracked over the years many a bucks that they'll veer off and go to a new blowdown, and they'll go in and start eating that moss. It's usually on, the higher limbs, and it's throughout the tree. And it grows where it's shady, so it depends how thick this green growth is. But they'll go in and I've seen where they'll walk right up one side and just feed all the way up one side of it, turn around and go right down the other side of it. I've seen where if there's moss way in, if they're there and they're picking around outside and there's moss further in, I've seen where they've whacked the limbs off with their antlers. They must, because there's broken limbs there, and then they can get at the moss further in, and they can feed. If you see that, hot tip here, if you see that when you're tracking, start looking around because he's not very far away.
Yeah, if he left some and he's going to bed down.
Yeah, if you get to that and you keep looking. The one I shot over here, we got talking about hunting away from Jackman there, but I shot that one over by the park. He got in doing that. He went right down one side of a blown down fir and was eating the old man's up the other side, and he'd laid down a couple of times, so he spent some time there. And I just got around it, and I see where he kind of went over through, and that's when I spotted him laying there. He was within 50 yards or so of that blown down spruce there. So
one thing that we didn't we talked about, the big hardwoods, but I've seen it happen, and guys that work in the woods, a lot of them, they carry something for a gun with them. But if they're in logging and they're logging those maples, a lot of times at night, the deer, will come in and eat those tops.
Oh, yeah.
So, back in the day when guys, didn't care what they shot and you could shoot does everywhere, northern Maine or whatever. I can remember when I first started hunting up in the Caucajo area in the 70s, a lot of those woodcutters were shooting does and small bucks that, came in that night and were eating on their tops, and they'd shoot them and drag them out to the log pile and then work all day and bring them home with them.
Yeah. That was their garden.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but anyways, that's why you're not going to find a place where the deer come and go. So the deer basically, and I'm sure it's anywhere in the big woods. I've never really hunted deer like down south in those places, but I have across the Midwest there and UP and in Minnesota, but in the Adirondacks. But it's the same way there. Those deer are more wanderers, and there's food wherever they go, basically, So if a buck's going to travel, he's traveling along, he doesn't have to go any particular place to get food. He's just along his route somewhere. There's going to be something to eat, and he'll stop and eat randomly, and that's it. That's how they get the food.
One of the things that we haven't touched on, but, for the Adirondack guys is it's kind of too bad. We have overcutting in Maine, and in the Adirondacks, it wouldn't hurt if they did a little bit of cutting in some of those places, because that's one of those things. Their natural feed is browse, and, we have plenty of browse, but some years we don't have enough canopy, so the winter is hard on them. But out in the Adirondacks, I can't tell you how many guys that they come to Maine and say, boy, I wish we could get some of this cutting. We don't, they don't want like northern Maine where you see giant clear cuts and stuff. But if they did selective cuts, like, just skid trails from, one beaver bog to another, or what, you can imagine how many deer would be in those places, because it would open up the forest and open up. They don't eat mature trees. They got to have brush. Yeah.
And that's why what I've noticed hunting over there is, and you get in the big areas where there's no logging, it's predominantly those wood ferns that they're eating. That's why I always thought it was funny. I always started talking to the guys that hunted over there, Joe and them and Jimmy Massett and stuff, and they always talk about when they're tracking the horn marks. And I don't know about you, but I very rarely see horn marks. And I got thinking about that more over the time. And then when I started hunting there, as I hunted a little bit more, I realized why they see the horn marks is because they have to feed on the ground. They have to get those wood fern buds, and they have to stick their nose down in there to get it. They either can pause some snow or just stick their nose down and get it. And that's why there's not always horn marks, but if they can see them more. But our bucks don't feed on the ground like that much. You know what I mean? They're not running their face down into the ground. I'll tell you, in all the years I've hunted, 40 years, or more than 40, 45 years now, I could count on probably my hands, or even my hands and my toes, the amount of horn marks I've seen in the snow tracking bucks. And usually if you do, it's where they're like in around a cut and the snow's kind of like held up by some stuff and they've stuck their head into that piece and you see the horns. Or maybe I've seen it before, like we talked about mushrooms, like there's a mushroom down at the base of a tree and they're trying to get it, so they stick their head around there and trying to get that mushroom, and then an antler hits. But I don't see antler marks all that often. I don't know about you.
Nope, I have seen it, but like you said, it's not a common occurrence, but probably that's because most of our deer are eating at eye level. They're eating on brush that's where they're at. We touched on it a little bit when we were talking with Caleb and with Brandon, but another thing when people are talking about big woods, we have big woods in Maine, and basically the northern half of Maine is, for the most part, is big woods, but it's different. Like over where we hunt in the Western Mountains, and again, we touched on it, the road system is not, there's not as many roads. There's a lot more places where you could go a few miles without bumping into a road, where, like up where Brandon is, he was talking about how about every mile or two there's a road. It's almost like a grid, and that's they're both big woods, but they're different kinds of big woods.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And it's just a function of where they can build a road. Over our way, over in the mountains, they just can't. There's places it's impossible to build a road, so there isn't going to be one. And the way the terrain's, it's up north, it's more efficient for logging. 'Cause if they just go down the road and they punch a road in straight as a die in there, punch it in a couple miles, get down the road, punch another one in, and just cut in between them. It's just efficiency. Yeah. They can't be as efficient trying to log around the mountains and stuff.
Back in the day, I can remember it's different now because with the mechanized logging, especially when they started having, harvesters that were on tracks and stuff, they can cut places in the mountains now that they couldn't with cable skidders, because you'd roll a cable skidder over and it was dangerous. Now they can harvest stuff that they didn't used to, and that's changed.
Yeah.
We've touched on this before, is I didn't realize it at the time, but in the 80s and the 90s, I graduated high school in 84, had my own vehicle. So in the 80s and the 90s, when I could travel north, I didn't realize I was in that small window where there was just about the right amount of cutting and everything was good and there was plenty of deer. And, but by into the 2000s, it started going the other way. And then we had those really bad winters. We didn't have the canopy to protect them. We had the bad winters, but.
Yeah. I remember reading even before I hunted much up there, and when I first started hunting up north, anybody that hunted there could see that they were cutting so much. It was they were going to run out of wood, but back then it was mostly paper companies that owned the land, and they assured that they were logging sustainably where there was wood there'd always be wood, Well, that's changed around. There's always wood, but it depends how big it is. So now they're cutting, a saw log at the mill is
spruce. You can get a 2x4 out of it.
Yeah, a 6-inch butt with a 4-inch top is a saw log. They never used to cut anything like that. Carol Huey told me back when they used to cut on the Great Northern owned a big part of the North Maine woods, but they also owned land over by Jackman, So they owned in that Holub country over there to the west. And Carol used to cut on that. And I think Gary Hall was the jobber for most of that for a long time, but they didn't cut a spruce or a fir tree less than 12-inch diameter at shoulder height or chest height. and they had to carry a string with them. And if they weren't sure if it was 12 inches by looking at it, the string was, in the pie system, if they put the string around and it touched, it wasn't big enough. So that's how the logging has changed. I mean, and that was, I think when he was talking about that, it was probably back in the 60s and 70s, before mechanized stuff started. They were cutting with skidders and chainsaws and stuff. But once the wood started dwindling, they had to go back and get the smaller stuff. And now it's hard to see any stand of wood that's got anything even 12-inch diameter. 12-inch diameter trees now are the big ones.
Yeah.
You get some scattered big spruce, like one here and one over there, and, not enough to, be a stand of wood to go cut. But there is a few old survivors, but
one thing I've thought about this quite a lot, and I'm glad it's happening, is there's quite a few places in northern Maine, especially in Somerset County where we live. Those sugaring operations are good for the fact that a place that they might have gone in and cut years ago and just gone in and cut all that big maple, now they've got to think, well, geez, there's enough here for a sugaring operation.
Yep.
So there's some big stands of maple now that would have got cut years ago, but with the way that they can do sugaring operations now, they're letting some of that stuff get some size to it.
You know what's funny about that, since you mentioned it, is I always thought, well, when they start them operations, they go in and they cut if there's any spruce or fir or even yellow birch, they try to get rid of everything else. Well, what becomes of that was when they do that, then the new growth comes up, but they don't want once it gets up over their heads, it's interfering with their sugar lines. So they cut it down with them brush saws and then more stuff. So they're always supplying new growth, even though it's a more open woods. And what I found is around a lot of them sugar camps, it's not all of them, but pretty fair amount of deer hang around there.
I've hunted for years the sugar shack that's up in your area, and exactly what you said is because that maple is big and the leaves are all off it by hunting season, the sunlight can get down in there, and it's every couple years they're cutting the brush out, but then the new stuff's coming back. I think there's a never-ending amount of small brush that's just right for those deer that keeps coming up. They knock it back, cups up, they knock it back.
Yeah, and the maples is where that wood fern grows a lot. So it's not only got some browse, it's full of them wood ferns in there that they love. So, yeah.
I remember back in the early 2000s, you would ask me when you still owned your other place if I would want to come up and guide for you the first week, and I would always, guide for you the first week and then go back home or whatever. And I've done that, again, since you started Big Woods Outfitters. But the first time you brought me in up above Jackman there and was going to show me some places where I could, start to bring my clients, we went into one of them sugaring operations, and same thing. There'd be sugar lines, but they're up high enough they don't bother the deer any. And we'd go up on some of those side hills, and that place was there was all kinds of nice little perches, and I built ground blinds up there, and you could look down in the little valleys. And over the years, my clients took quite a few bucks up there near that sugaring operation.
Yeah. Yeah. I always, when they first started doing it, I go, there goes another piece of deer woods. But quite frankly, it saved a lot of deer woods,
I've come to places when I'm tracking bucks before, and it usually, I'm sure that they're mostly softwood stumps, but you'll come to these stumps, old stumps out in the woods that are all broken down and rotten, and the bucks will paw the snow away from that or whatever, and they paw in the ground beside those rotten stumps, and I don't know if they're licking the ground there or what, but they're pawing around the ground around those rotten stumps, and I always wondered why they did that.
Probably somebody set a salt block on them at one time.
Maybe that's it. But that's what I'm saying. Maybe there's some kind of, when those stumps are rotting down, maybe there's something for either natural salt or something for, something that they're hungry
Yeah.
for. And I wonder if because I've seen that on multiple times tracking a buck, and he goes by one of them great big old rotten stumps, and they'll paw back, and it looks like they were pawing for something in the ground there. I don't know if they're licking it or what they're doing.
There might be a mineral. I've only ever found one. I've heard of them before. People talk about mineral licks in the ground for different animals. And I only ever remember finding one, what I could see was a real natural mineral lick in the woods. And it just so happened that it was, and this was when I found that 25 years ago, it's when they were cutting all those checkerboards over in the Adian Township there. And in one of those checkerboards, I was going through there. All of a sudden, I started seeing a lot of deer tracks, And it was, they were 5-acre checkerboards, a clear cut 5 acres, and it was in one of them clear cuts. And I got to this spot, and it was just, it looked like a sheet. It was paved with deer tracks. And in one spot, there was looked like a spring coming out of the ground. And it must have brought minerals, but it was leaching out there, and it was wet. So it was kind of muddy around it. And the deer tracks went in every direction there. But that's the only one I've ever found. Now, I have found, like I joked about a salt block on a stump, because the Canadians, when they used to log back when it was with saws, there was a lot of Canadians come down and log. They were known to do that, get a salt block and lug it out in one of the cuts. And back then they weren't clear cutting, but just in the woods. And they'd set it on a stump, and that would leach down into the stump as it rotted. That's why I was wondering. Yeah. But there wasn't like a lot of them where they'd be everywhere. But I have found them over the years. A lot of them would be up on the Canadian border.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One other thing that we didn't really touch on, and you don't see them as much now, and I still spend a little bit of time in that Enchanted region, but when I was younger and hunted over there a little bit more, I don't see as much from Lake Jackman up to the border, but those hazelnut bushes, deer, but usually they're gone by then, and the bears love them, but I don't see as much of that stuff. I don't know if that's one of those plants that's going by the wayside, but there used to be quite a lot of that down in the Enchanted region.
Yeah, it's funny, it grows. Where it grows, you'll find probably quite a bit of it in an area, and then there's places it doesn't grow, but I find it frequently. I don't know if the deer eat the hazelnuts or not. I know the bears get the majority of them, because if there's
that's what I'm saying.
And they don't grow every year either. They're almost like a beech nut cycle. It might be every other year or every third year, but it's not. And it might be some years there might be a few. But I've seen a few years that just a few years ago we had a bumper crop of them. I remember, and that interferes with bear hunting too, because the bears love them things. Oh. They're easy to get because them bushes don't grow more than 8 feet high, so the bears can get in there and just munch them right down. But I've never noticed. I knew when we went to Ontario, because they had different feed out there. Remember?
Yeah.
They had popple. They didn't have maple. They had popple, and they'd eat them red whips, them red osiers around them swales and stuff. But they would, in the wintertime, I suspect is when it was doing it, because they was hungriest, they would eat that hazelnut. They'd browse it. Now, they don't. Moose will a little bit here, but I don't see, unless there was some that was in a deer yard where they really get hungry. But they don't favor that, because it is a pretty hard bush, Of
course, we didn't touch on, we're talking about nuts. They do love beech nuts, but, a lot of our beech has that disease now. That's another thing. I don't think there's doesn't seem to be as many beech nuts now as there was when I was younger. And a lot of times you'll see what you think is a beech nut. It's the hull, but you break those open, and a lot of them, the seed's not in there. No, it's like a hull with almost nothing in it.
Yeah, what would be the nut? They're usually empty. They're like got a triangle shape to them. Remember, they got a 3-sided thing, but they won't be filled out. They'll just be the skin from that, like the husky, not a husk, but a hard skin thing. and they'll be completely empty some years. But they have, you're right, there isn't much beech anymore. They've logged all of the big beech that would be the producers.
Yeah.
You hardly see a big beech tree in the woods anymore, unless you get into a place that's just hasn't been cut.
And I think the bears too, that it's one of those things that probably by the time you're hunting deer, if it was a really good beech nut place, the bears and partridge and every other thing else has been in there, or maybe the deer ate it early. But I think I told you once, there was more than one, but there was one particular right up on the top of that. It was not really a mountain, but up on the top of that hill in by mile 5 that I like to hunt. I had Sue with me once, and there was a great big beech tree on the top of that. And I didn't even know. I mean, I would have figured it out when I got up there, but as soon as Sue saw it, she said, "Oh man," she said, "I got to go over and take some pictures of that." But that tree evidently was big enough and healthy enough. It had a lot of really good beech nuts in it. And a bear, it looked like a guy had been in there with a chainsaw, but there was a ring right around that beech tree. It looked like a brush pile. And a big bear had gone up in that beech tree, and he was breaking off limbs almost as big as my wrist. And beech is pretty tough. That shows you how tough and strong them bears are. He was breaking through great big limbs and snapping them off.
They bite them too. They'll bite them right off.
Snap them off and had like a brush pile right around that. And again, I don't remember the last time I saw a tree that was right, and there were still beech nuts around that, but you just don't see that a lot anymore.
No, and then usually what I found, if a beech gets big enough to start having nuts again, 6-inch diameter or whatever, those are usually the ones there's nothing in them. They don't seem to have, any meaty nut to them. But so it's but all the years I've tracked bucks, 45 now, I guess. Only one time, and that was early on, that was back in my learning years, that I tracked a buck that went under a beech tree where there was nuts. And I could see where he was eating in the beech nuts. Other than that, not saying they don't eat them. They probably do if they could find some, any kicking around. But it isn't anything that, especially for a buck to go to, because if it was, then following as many bucks as we have, that you'd see it more often. But
and according to I posted a couple of weeks ago, I posted that Throwback Thursday on V.E. Lynch. And if you read any of his books and his old magazine articles and stuff, he was up in the Ashland area, in by Machias Lake and in that country. That's where they used to hunt deer. Evidently, there was a lot of mature beech back then, because he talked about going up on the beech nut ridges and hunting deer and bear. That's how they hunted back then. I'm
sure it was back in the day, because it's still that way in the Adirondacks, because that's one thing they do have is they kind of hope for a beech nut year, because they've got some big beech there. In the years that they do, that will draw the deer to the beech ridges.
Yeah.
See, people would always ask me about that. They say, I got to find some beech ridges. Is there any beech nuts this year? And I just told them, I said, don't waste your time trying to figure that out. I said, there's deer everywhere, but I says, if you think you got to get to a beech ridge to hunt deer, you're wasting your time,
Yeah.
But out there, I think they seems to congregate the deer more, because it's a specialty food for them. So
they've got less food than we do.
Yeah, they got less food, and it's probably a delicacy. So the years it's a lot of beech nuts, and they've got bears there too. I don't think they have the number of bears we have, but so there's probably enough mature beech and enough nuts where they can get enough of them hit the ground where the deer can get them, So, and I know in some places in the Adirondacks they have oak, so they'll have some acorn years out there, but I don't think really there's too much anywhere in the big woods of Maine where there's acorns. You get down the forks, down along the river there's acorns. But that's actually where you're just starting to convert. I think between the Forks and Bingham is where you're changing out of the boreal forest into the regular forest because you get more. Wherever that changes, you'll get more hemlock, oak,
Pine. There's more
pine.
pine
There's
down
more
there too.
white pine down there. And then there's less spruce and fir.
Right.
The woods kind of changes out of the boreal forest line there. So
Down where our bear business is, like in between Route 16 and up to Moxie, that whole big piece of woods up in there, you can tell because you see some oak in there. Not a ton, but you see some oak in there, and you see some hemlock in there, and you see more white pine, which that one of the things that really surprised me when I first started guiding deer hunters up in Jackman area, especially north of town. Like if you go from Jackman up towards the border, there's not a lot of white pine up there.
no. You can see them from a distance. If you stood on like a ridge
stand
and
out.
you looked over on a ridge, if you see one tree that looks half again as tall as the rest, it's a pine tree.
Yeah.
Because they never, in a lot of places, there just was never enough pine to cut, so they left them, and they probably hoped that they produce some more seeds. You get down in the Spencer country, there's more pine.
Yeah.
Down around the prisoner of war camp, there was quite a grove of pine there, but it's different soil too. I think when you get down,
I think it
Out
likes
of the-
sandier soil.
it's sandier soil, and that seems to be where pine grows better in the sandy soil, and probably oak does too. Steve Coleman told me one time, I asked him why there was no oak up around, or if he knew of any, but he said it's the soil conditions and also the weather. I guess they're not tolerant to a colder climate either, the oaks and stuff. Because and then if you notice, if you go north towards the Arctic, it also changes. You run out of different species,
Right.
until you run out of maple. I think that's why there wasn't really any maple in that northwest Ontario we hunted, and then from there north. But once you get north of, like, up into Quebec, it's probably north of the St. Lawrence, but there's no maple when you get up there. And I've been caribou hunting there, and there's basically spruce and fir and
Birch.
and that's about it. And Alaska's the same way.
Yeah.
Popple, birch, spruce and fir, that's about it for wood.
The topsoil, I think that's probably got something to do with there's not a lot of topsoil in those places.
Yeah. Yep. The glaciers brought it all south
Yeah. Dumped it.
after the ice ages. But, well, all right. I think that's a pretty good conversation on that. I hope
Yeah,
everybody.
and what we think Big Woods is.
Yeah, I hope everybody understands that, and then you can start piecing it together. But I think the main point of it is don't if you want to hunt in the big woods, you have to change your mindset from the farm country. I always tried to. Only way I could explain it to people, my clients especially too, was forget about what you know about deer hunting and learn over again. I mean, obviously scrapes and rubs, that kind of stuff pertains, but most people just don't have any concept of how far these deer will travel and all of that. So which kind of confines them to small areas. That's why people don't get in far enough and all of that.
I think this is one of those podcasts that probably is not quite as entertaining as the ones that we normally do. Is more like information, but if
Yeah.
you're really serious about it, the stuff that we talked about is gonna, tell you where you should go and what you should be looking for. And one other thing, because we are, we're supposed to be educating people and helping them. Again, it was something that we touched with the previous two guests is if you want to go where there's fewer roads and you don't mind the mountains, the western part of Maine is probably where you want to go. And if you want to go where it's flatter and there's more roads, north and east will probably be better for you.
Yeah, and like a lot of times because we hunt the mountains more, and then I know there's a lot of people that either listen or watch us or whatever that say, geez, I don't think I could get up in them mountains and hunt. Well, if you don't think you can, I mean, we got plenty of low ground too. We got access to, there's plenty of low ground. You don't have to crawl in the mountains, but the mountains is usually how you get away from most of the people, you know. But there's all kinds of places across the North Maine woods and in the big woods that pretty easy going, you know. It's pretty rolling hills and it's not as strenuous. Plus, like the other guys were saying, you know, Brandon and Caleb, there's so many roads that, you know, you don't have to worry about getting lost either, you know. Even over our way, there's enough, but you could have a pretty long walk out in some of the places we hunt to get back out to a road. But
if you're worried about having to drag your buck 3 miles, there's probably most of those places up in the county. If you shoot your buck, if you've got your Onyx, you probably are going to have most places you probably ain't going to have more than a mile drag to be to a road, and it's going to be a flatter drag.
Yeah, I doubt there's any place that'd be a mile, really, thinking about it. I mean, unless you were in behind you'd gone in like a gate, usually not gated, but rocked off road, or they took the culverts out where you can't drive. Quite frankly, that's where I would suggest you go hunt, because most people still drive the roads looking for a track or trying to find a place to hunt from the roads, and should really try to get back in there and find some little pocket back in the middle of nowhere, and you probably have it all to yourself. So, all right then. We'll see if we get any comments or questions on that. If you do, if you're not sure about, well, I think we covered it pretty good, but if you had a question, didn't understand it, put it in the comments and we'll try to get it to you. So,
and the other thing is, whenever we're having a discussion about this, not everything that we say is written in stone. A lot of time it's a generalization. 75 or 80% of the time.
Oh yeah,
that's what they're doing.
Deer are individuals, so there's nothing. I have to tell people that they have said, yeah, deer do this all the time. If anybody tells you a deer does something all the time, don't listen to them, because they don't know what they're talking about. Deer individuals. They all learn from their experience in life, and they do different things. But so anyways, yeah, give us some comments there, or put the questions in it, and we'll go from there. So once again, thanks for joining in, and make sure you subscribe if you haven't, and we'll support our sponsors. And till next time, good luck on the trail.